I come at this, I'm a health psychologist by training. That means that I try and figure out why people do dumb things with their health. Why do people smoke cigarettes? Why do they drink too much? And all this sort of stuff. I became interested in this particular question basically because of my mother. Not because she was doping, but because she used to work for the Australian Sports Drug Agency, and they asked me to help them out. And one thing led to another, and 10 years later, here I am, someone who spent a decade of my life looking at these issues. To be very clear, I am for drug control in sport. What I am not happy about is the way that the World Anti-Doping Code works. I think there is a better way of dealing with drug control in sport. I don't think the Anti-Doping Code is the right way to go about doing it. So what we've got, and trying to intersect the notion and segue between the science that we've heard and the law that we're about to hear, there's a dream about anti-doping. There's a dream about what sport could be, a purity. It comes from the ancient Olympics. And then there's the reality. So in my world, this is what we call the difference between a social policy. It's really easy to say social policy. Drugs are bad. Drugs in sport are really bad. And anyone who takes drugs in sport should be kicked out of sport forever because they're evil people. That's social policy. What's really hard though is when we start thinking about how do we enact that policy and what does it actually mean? So what I'll do tonight is just give you a little bit of an insight into some of the things that I think about and have looked at over the last decade. So the dream is drug-free sport. We hear this word drug-free. We've got drug-free sport New Zealand. On Twitter, I got taken to task at one point for saying that nowhere in the World Anti-Doping Code does it say drug-free sport, to which I then pointed out that you actually have organisations called drug-free sport around the world. So drug control in sport is actually probably a really good idea, and here are some reasons why I think it is. In Canberra, where I come from, I had a chat with a guy who was in his 40s. He loved playing hockey. But, you know, now that I'm in my 40s, I kind of get the fact that you slow down a little bit. Your knees don't work so well, and those young folk really do run rather quickly. So he thought that taking amphetamines would be a really good way of keeping up. Okay? Gives you a bit of extra speed, a bit of extra energy. And I kind of said to him, have you had a psychotic break? It's like, what would happen if someone on amphetamines had a psychotic break in a hockey game and wrapped that stick around someone's head? Okay, this is not good. Another reason that we might have drug control in sport is that, as some of you may know, in America you can make a lot of money out of sport. And for a lot of people, sport is a way of getting out of poverty. So what will happen is that especially in impoverished African American neighbourhoods, parents will go to immunologists and other medical professionals and say, endocrinologists, and say, can you give my child human growth hormone so that they might be big enough to play in the NBA or the NFL? You can't abuse children with drugs for the sake of sport, guys. It doesn't work. So this is another good reason why we should control drugs. Another one which I think is really good is marijuana. It affects your ability to coordinate. Okay, so if you've got a gymnast doing a particularly complicated routine and their coordination is affected because they smoked a bong, you know, some point to maybe calm their nerves down before the event, and their coordination is affected and they catch their neck on the uneven bars. These are really good reasons for us to control drugs in sport. So we've then got this idea of we get this idea, we've got a drug control, we've got to control drugs, and let's try and deal with the purity of it. And we end up with the war on drugs in sport. We go from the war on drugs, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Drugs are bad, people who use drugs are bad, and we should put them in jail. And certainly the Americans have pushed this ideology on the rest of the world for a number of years now. And some places like Portugal are fighting back against this and presenting alternative ways of doing it. But we end up with this idea that we should have a war on drugs in sport. And this notion that we have a war is really important. So there's something we call the social discourse around drug control. When we start talking about a war, we have an enemy. Whenever we have an enemy, we have someone who is not human. They are bad people, they are somehow subhuman, and we can start doing whatever we like to them. We're beginning to see some of this kind of language re-emerge in the United States after the recent presidential election. I've received correspondence from other academics in the United States where they're already seeing some of this language of marginalisation and stereotyping and prejudice beginning to re-emerge already. So we've got the war on drugs in sport so that we can protect this ideal of drug-free sport. Now, I really get worried about this notion of drug-free sport because, as we've already seen tonight, there are an awful lot of drugs that do get used in sport for very good reason. Painkillers is one which comes up all the time. The work that I have seen, now this comes from the World Anti-Doping Agency drug control, where what they do is athletes who turn up for a drug control have to write down all the substances that they've taken. When you look at those lists of substances, the average athlete across the Olympics, in the World Athletics Championships and the World Cup in football will go on to a game, a pitch, with 2.5 to 3 drugs in their system. Athletes need to have drugs to compete at the elite level. Any athlete who tells you that they don't take any kind of drugs, so that's a supplement, over-the-counter, stuff that they might get from their medical practitioner, it's just not a reality. Athletes have to use these substances to actually get up and get onto the pitch every week, okay? When you look at growing up in Sydney, a lot of rugby league, those guys hit each other pretty hard regularly. The fact that they can back up and play again the next week is incredible. So we've got the dream. We've got this war on drugs in sport, and we're going to have this drug-free sport ideal, even though we can't actually have drug-free sport. The reality is that we build a really wicked problem for ourselves. Now, the definition of a wicked problem is that every time you try and solve that problem, a new problem comes up. And that's what's happened with anti-doping. We've got this problem. We don't like the fact that people take drugs in sport because sport is a pure and virtuous activity. But when we try and build a system to actually control it, we end up having all sorts of problems. Now, the reason for this that I put to people all the time is that it was built in pursuit of science and in pursuit of the law. The architects of the World Anti-Doping Code were sports physicians, sports scientists, and lawyers. Now, while these people are really good at science and the law, they're not always thinking about what their policies, their ideas, the science, what does it mean for the human being at the end? What does it mean for the person who is actually going to experience this system? One of the things that a number of commentators have now started to point out, and this is a little bit technical in terms of how they talk about it, people become the object rather than the subject of a legal system. Now, what's happened in the World Anti-Doping Code is that initially, the idea was that we would be protecting athletes from people who we deemed to be cheating. So we were actually doing this whole notion of drug control for the athletes. We were doing it to protect athletes from people who were seeking to undermine the integrity of competition. What's happened, though, over time is that athletes have become the object. Anti-doping is something we do to athletes. They don't have a voice in the system. They don't have a place in the system. Something which makes me really cranky all the time is that athletes do not have a direct voice in the World Anti-Doping Agency boards. They have an advisory committee. Athletes are allowed to give advice which can be completely ignored by the 50% of the board which is from the government and the 50% of boards which comes from the International Olympic Committee. Athletes do not have a voice on this committee, and it makes me really cranky because their experiences are not taken into account in the way that they might if they did have a controlling voice in those boards. And it might actually make athletes become the centre of drug control, the purpose for drug control, rather than all these other interests, namely the interests of the International Olympic Committee and the governments which have signed up to that particular code. For those of you who are maths nerds, you'll notice that I've put the Mandelbrot set up there. The Mandelbrot set is about chaos. And no matter how closely you look at that, that pattern keeps repeating further and further you look into it. It never ends. The complexity, the chaos never ends. And that's what we've got a problem with now. It's easy to say something like, let's ban performance-enhancing drugs. Okay, what is doping? Oh, well, I know what doping is. Doping is when you take a performance-enhancing drug. No, it's not. The definition of doping under the World Anti-Doping Code is that you have violated one of 10 anti-doping rule violations. Article 2.1 and 2.2 relate to the use of a drug. Okay, fair cop, I've got that. If you use the drug, you violated the code, that is probably about doping, and so long as those substances are doping, which I'll talk about in a minute, you should be okay. Then we start getting into things like, do you have the drug in your possession? Have you attempted to traffic the drug? Have you associated with someone who is serving a sanction? Now, this becomes a real problem when you think about someone who might go to an event, a sports event. They have a performance-enhancing drug, something which is on the prohibited list, in their pocket. Okay, they turn up and they're actually dealing with athletes. They're directly involved in the preparation of athletes. They can be sanctioned for that. Not only can they be sanctioned for it, but then if they go back and work with that club or anyone else in sport again, the people who work with them can be sanctioned. This becomes a real problem when we get to kids. So what is doping? Doping is not just about the use of certain drugs. Doping is about doing things which they deem offensive to sport or somehow impugns the integrity of the anti-doping system. One of the classic ones for this is the athlete whereabouts system. So if you are an athlete, you have to give your whereabouts to the World Anti-Doping Agency, or in Australia to ASADA if you're in the registered testing pool. You have to be available for testing 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, every day of the year. Not only do you have to do that, you actually have to tell them 3 months in advance where you will be for the golden hour that you will be available for drug testing. Now, this is not my observation, it's an observation by one of the very prominent scholars in the field. The only people that we usually require to have that level of control over are pedophiles. Okay? We are actually directly impugning the human rights of athletes. There are questions around the human rights. Okay, so what is doping? It's actually a lot more than what people think it is. What is the prohibited list? Okay, to appear on the prohibited list, you must satisfy 2 of the 3 following tests. The substance is performance enhancing, the substance impugns the health of an athlete, or the substance violates the spirit of sport statement. Currently working on a paper which looks at this in more detail. What do they mean by performance enhancing? It talks about things like, is there scientific evidence, is there pharmacologic evidence, or is there experience that the substance is performance enhancing? So the way that we determine that third test, experience, is, for example, with mildronate, meldonium, we think athletes are using it because they think it might be performance enhancing, so we better ban it. So the actual test is it performance enhancing? Well, if people think it's performance enhancing, then it probably is. The other side to this is we end up with this paradox where substances which are demonstrably performance enhancing, like caffeine, are allowed through, but substances which are clearly not performance enhancing, like marijuana, are prohibited. So clearly there's an issue going on here in terms of, is the anti-doping code about performance enhancing drugs, or is it about drug control in sport more broadly? Which one is it, guys? Just so long as you're clear about which one we're doing, we can then know what this is all about. Is it about anti-doping or is it about drug control? Second test, health. A drug either has medical, scientific, pharmacologic evidence or experience, or has the potential to harm someone's health. Now, one of the great things about caffeine when we talk about this is that caffeine, everyone can say, oh, it's fine. You can kill yourself with caffeine just as quickly as you can kill yourself with any drug that you misuse or abuse. People look at me and say, oh, how can you kill yourself with caffeine? There was a kid in Ohio, he was a wrestler, who took a teaspoon of anhydrous caffeine. So in your cup of coffee, you would have between 85 and about 165 milligrams of caffeine. Your no-dose pill has about 100 milligrams of caffeine. This kid took a teaspoon with 10 grams of caffeine. His heart exploded. Okay, caffeine is likely to damage your health if you misuse or abuse it. Equally, there is evidence to show that if you use anabolic steroids under correct medical supervision, it has very little impact on your health. That's why we use it for therapeutic applications all over the place. So we've got another little contradiction going on there. The third test is the spirit of sport. Now, everybody knows what the spirit of sport is. It's very obvious. It's things like ethics and fair play and honesty and fun and joy and teamwork and courage. I still am yet to try and figure out what ethics, fair play and honesty actually means. Unlike every other part of the World Anti-Doping Code, which has got excruciating amounts of detail in terms of the definition and how things are to be interpreted, the spirit of sport statement has no interpretation. How does the spirit of sport statement interpret health, which appears as the second value, differently to the pharmacological, medical, or other experience or potential to impugn the health of the athlete? We actually don't know. So the third test, spirit of sport, has been widely criticised for being an administrative catch-all which basically lets them prohibit anything they want. Okay? So when we look at it, performance criterion can be, well, we don't know what the performance enhancement might be. Is it 0.1%? Is it 3%? Is it 5%? What's the threshold? Health. What kind of health does it have to impugn? What about the World Health Organization definition? Is it physical health? Is it mental health? Is it social health? Or is it spiritual health? Which of these does it have to transgress, by what degree and by how much, before it's actually allowed to be considered to be transgressing that particular criterion? The spirit of sport statement, who the hell knows? Nobody actually understands that one. The next point is that anti-doping is about elite male sport. Okay, so examples of this are that if you were going to design drug control for women's sport, okay, women are sanctioned, they experience anti-doping rule violation related sanctions at 1/5 the rate of men. And when you look at what they're actually being sanctioned for, most of them are actually not the performance enhancing products that men use. They're for things like masking agents associated with weight control, diuretics, so things that make you wee a lot. Okay? Women use drugs for weight control. It's things like they might be trying to deal with stress. It might be other masking agents. We're not seeing women using these kinds of drugs quite the same way. If you were setting up drug control for women's sport, what you would do is aim at the misuse and abuse of prescription drugs and supplements aimed at things like weight control and managing mood and stress. Okay, another one which always makes me very cranky in relation to how women are marginalised is, and this is a real, I have a 7-year-old daughter and it always makes me very upset to convey this, so I apologise if I get a bit emotional about it. Back in the bad old days of the Olympics, which wasn't too long ago, they had something called gender testing. So Caster Semenya has just been through this. They would actually medically scrutinise women to determine their gender. They would have nudie parades. They would line the women up and they would have to then be examined by a physician to determine that their genitalia were in fact female. Now, what happens in a drug test, okay, so this is production of a urine sample. You have to stand with your legs apart, you're naked from here to here. You squat, right? And then someone puts their head about here to ensure that they can see the sample exit the urethra into the sample collection vessel. What that means in layman's terms is that someone watches the urine stream come out of your penis or vagina and go into a collection vessel. In some countries, they actually ask women to move the labial folds back to expose the urethra. Now, okay, remember I said I have a 7-year-old daughter, right? People sit there and they say to me, no, they wouldn't drug test children. The youngest person drug tested that I know of that's in the media was 9 years old. It's a 9-year-old boy in the UK who was drug tested after a rugby camp. Right? Could you imagine what that 9-year-old kid is going through? Now, I'm sorry, I don't see how drug testing a child like that invasive procedure, justifies protecting the integrity of the 100 metres final of the men's 100 metres final at the Olympics. I don't see the relationship. How does impugning that child, can you imagine the distress that they're under? Having a stranger watch them urinate while a group of other adults all look on. Okay? What about their parents aren't there? They've got someone who's standing there whose job it is to look after the kid, but if they interfere with that drug control, their job's on the line because they signed it into their contract that they would support the World Anti-Doping Code. Okay? This is what it takes to protect sport from drugs. This is a wicked problem. This is something I get cranky about. This is wrong. Okay? There has to be a better way of doing this. The other one that gets me really worked up, and this happened to a friend of mine, she had a 14-year-old daughter who had made it to the national level of a sport. Now, I teach health psychology. We talk a lot about body image. We talk a lot about women's body image, not so much men's. Can you imagine what kind of damage that test is going to do to a young woman who is already sensitive about her body and having someone scrutinise her genitals like that? Okay? Again, you're risking someone's mental health for what? To protect the integrity of the 100 metres final at the 1988 Seoul Olympics? Okay? I just don't see the relationship. That's why I argue that it's about elite male sport. When you look at the amount of money it costs to run anti-doping, like $20,000, $30,000 per analytic positive, the only sport that can afford to pay that is elite male sport. Not women's sport, although hopefully with AFLW, maybe we'll start seeing women generating that kind of income. But by and large, masters level sport, junior sport, who can afford all this? We know that in the US, they've had some of the largest high school drug testing programs in the world. They were abandoned on the grounds that they didn't find anything. The thing that hopefully will also convince you about that there's some problems here, parents can be banned for life. So follow the chain of dominoes. To my knowledge, it hasn't happened, so it's hypothetical at the moment. So what can happen is that you take your child to an event having signed the membership papers. So just be aware, if your kids play sport, when you sign that membership agreement at the beginning, you need to check whether or not you have just signed your child up to be World Anti-Doping Code compliant, which means they can be drug tested. Okay, when I looked at signing my kids up to some sports, I won't name them, I actually had trouble finding where it said my kids would be World Anti-Doping Code compliant, but I found it. Now, I'm a world expert in the area and I had to dig. Right? Now, if you ask an athlete, a support person, a trainer, someone else and say, can you just explain to me what it means to be anti-doping compliant? Oh, don't worry about it, it never happens. That's not good enough. What if it does happen to your child? So, okay, you've signed up, you've signed on the dotted line, you are now a World Anti-Doping Code compliant person, you are now subject to the full weight of ASADA. You go along to an event and you give your child a tablet to try and help them overcome a cold. That tablet contains pseudoephedrine. Okay, your child then tests positive, your child is now banned. Okay, they now have to live with listing on the ASADA website that they are a drug cheat. And that's public and it stays for life. How do we know this happens? Two 15-year-olds at the Singapore Youth Olympic Games used a diuretic, they were detected, their names were published publicly. What that will do for their ability to get a job into the future or to secure a lease, right, renting a property, I don't know. Nobody knows. So your child is a drug cheat. What this means for your child is that they are no longer allowed to play sport with their friends. Because under Article 2.10, the association rule, if you associate with someone who is serving a sanction, you can also be sanctioned. Okay? So your kid is now effectively excommunicated from sport. Just remember, the IOC has as one of its aims to give sport to everyone. Sport is about participation, creating peace in the world through sport. What happens to the parent? The parent has supplied a prohibited substance to a minor. That carries an automatic life ban. Okay? Because it's deemed that if you give these things to a minor, a child, that's worse than anything else. What that means is that the parent is now excommunicated from sport for life and cannot be involved with their child preparing for sport. Okay? Hasn't happened so far as I know, but it is possible under the code. So these are some of the wicked problems that I deal with and I inconveniently bring up. Okay, and usually I just get met with, oh, don't be stupid, that would never happen. Okay, so it's a wicked problem, it is a problem. What do we do about it? I've been banging on for a huge amount of time now about needing to get second generation drug control. Anti-doping was a great thing for giving us the ability to start talking about how do we control drugs. It is a great experiment. The experiment has run its course, we have problems, the system is now at a point where we need to learn from what we've seen with anti-doping and start to move on. Harm minimisation is the only other game in town. Harm minimisation basically means that we accept the idea that athletes are going to use drugs, and what we need to do is try and stop them from hurting themselves with those substances. It is evidence-based. So if you go in and you start talking to people in the medical fraternity, they will tell you that harm minimisation is the best way to control the harms associated with drug use, substance misuse and abuse. How do we know? Because in countries like Portugal, where they have engaged these sorts of things where if you are a drug addict, they don't send you to jail for using an illegal drug, they get you treatment. They help you deal with all of those things that made you take that drug. I think that's a great way to respond to drugs in sport. Okay, athlete, wow, you must be really hurting to feel the need to take these drugs so that you can continue your sporting career. How do we actually work with you to make sure that you don't feel the need to take these drugs? Now we see, for example, Ben Barber with the cocaine thing post the grand final in the NRL. Okay, look, you took cocaine. Why did you feel the need to take cocaine? Let's treat you for thinking that you need to use these illicit substances which are really seriously going to damage your health. Okay? Take them out of the game for a while. Let them recover from it. Of course, the AFL has had its own experiences with this, of course, quite famously with Ben Cousins. It is actually achievable. We can do it. I've written extensively about how we could modify the current world anti-doping system to develop a harm minimisation system. It's in chapter 12 of my book. It's actually quite easy to do. Just requires a few tweaks rather than a wholesale change of the system. What's missing is the political will. It's seen to be a bit, not quite the right thing to do, to say we will condone athletes using drugs. We would rather pretend that athletes don't use drugs. Okay? But what we need to do is try and engender the political will. This is part of what the organisation Justice for the 34 is trying to do. Let's build some political will to recognise that we can do things better. And it has to start down at our level, the grassroots level, because goodness knows at the political level at the moment, there's not an awful lot going on. The other method that I've proposed, and literally I'm the only person in the world who starts talking about this stuff, is the stakeholder-led drug control model. Basically, sport is not just about the IOC and governments around the world. Sport is about fans, sport is about sponsors, sport is about athletes, sport is about event organisers, sport is about merchandisers, broadcasters and so on. These are all people who have a legitimate stake in sport. So what would happen if we actually brought these people together to talk about what role drugs might take, instead of having the IOC telling everyone this is the only role? One of the things that I just still don't get it. Why is the AFL World Anti-Doping Code compliant? What is good for the Olympic movement is not necessarily good for the AFL. Okay, they're two different things. The AFL has enough money to turn around to the federal government and say, you know what, we don't need your juniors funding. Go away, we can deal with it ourselves and we will have our own drug control. The NFL do it and the NBA do it. The AFL can do it as well. As part of the democratisation of sport, I would like to see athlete-led drug control for sport. I would like to see the athletes saying what they think should and should not be used. Example that I commonly use. Cyclists might think using erythropoietin, EPO, increases red blood cell count, increases oxygenation in the body. They might think that EPO is perfectly fine. Okay, what's wrong with using EPO? Now, it has more moral weight when all the people who you play the sport with say, we don't want you to use EPO. as opposed to having a bunch of suits or guys in white coats saying, you shouldn't use that because we feel that it besmirches, I don't know, the amount of money we might make out of sport. Okay, just as a random example. So they're my thoughts about where the wicked problem lies and what we might do about it. As I move on from my academic career, my contact details will change. These are my new contact details. So I'll be working for a very small niche boutique consulting company called Critical Friend Consulting. One of the things that I'm really keen to do with this company is I want to work with boards. One of the things I have learned in my time working in this space is that most people actually don't know basic things like, why is a drug banned? What are the 3 tests? What is the evidence behind it? What is a drug test? What does it mean to do that? What are my obligations as an athlete support person if I see someone doping? The reason that I can say all this stuff is because I'm the human being who did the research that found out that these are massive deficiencies in what we do. So that's part of what I'm doing. One of the things I would love to do, and more power to ASADA, they have just released a magnificent sports integrity package. The reason I say that is because they included me in it as a counterpoint. So obviously they've got some wisdom finally around this issue, and I think it's fantastic that they have included an alternative view. So I'm really keen to start building education about anti-doping which is not predicated on someone who is World Anti-Doping Code compliant. I am scrupulous in making sure that I do not sign documentation to say that I will be. This means that I can provide an independent view presenting evidence. Everything that I have spoken about tonight, there are peer-reviewed papers from the academic literature, from the scholarly literature, which support everything. I am not presenting you a mix of like, oh, this is what I think it's all about and I'm going to try and sway you one way or the other. I don't need to do anything other than tell you this is how it works. And by the time I've finished, just presenting the facts, most people will look at me and say, you know what, Jason, we really need to change this anti-doping system. So thank you very much for your time and your attention this evening.